If the latter, then there'll be somebody to be brought back in chariots. When will the Israelites be voluntarily returned to Israel, and how? That's an outstanding question yet.
Brethren, I want to thank both of you for the presentations and for bringing into focus some of the questions that really are ones that we need to study out, brethren. We need to study these out and come to some closure on them. As we got into the preparations for our evening session, we realized that there were far more questions than we were going to have the opportunity to cover in 1 hour. And the question that I have presented to the brethren as well is linked directly to the Ezekiel 38 citation. We've read it, but it specifically says in verse 11, I will go up to a land of unwalled villages, to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls, having neither bars nor gates. At the present time, you're looking at the security wall that has been constructed. There literally is a wall now between the areas that are predominantly Jewish and those that are predominantly Arab. And there are 600 checkpoints or crossing points between the areas that are predominantly Jewish and those that are predominantly Arab. And so my question is, can you tell me what you see in a way of the practical things that will need to occur to bring down this wall, or will this wall not be brought down? My concern, of course, is if we haven't correctly identified the unwalled village period, we may be waiting for these walls to come down and see things move further along in the stream of time. So I'm going to turn that over to you, brethren. What do you see in the way of practical things that need to happen? Brother Jim, you've got the mic.
Okay. One of the possible things here, and this is possibility, not definite, we see Iran building up the nuclear threat. If the nuclear threat is serious against Israel, that's way across at the Mediterranean, how much more serious is it to Arabia, just on the other side of the Persian Gulf? I think that's prodding the Arabs towards rapprochement with Israel, because they both have a common enemy. And the enemy of my enemy may be my friend. I think this is perhaps what it may be in order to lead up to the thought of unwalled villages, that the Arabs will see Iran as a greater threat than Israel, because the population is about 10 times as much, and there's some pretty nasty fellows over there. I guess they call it Iran because people want to get out of there in a hurry.
Thank you, Brother Jim. Brother Len.
Jim and I grew up in the same hometown, about a mile apart, and I've been living with those kind of jokes for 60 years. It's an interesting question. My problem is I cannot see anything that resolves this issue, truly resolves the issue in a peaceful way. And that's why I think this Zechariah 12, which is one of the scriptures I had listed, which I think describes an attack by those around Israel, I think it has to be resolved militarily. And if you look at verse 2 of Zechariah 12, it says, I'm going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the peoples around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it will also be against Judah. And then in verse 6, in that day I will make the clans of Judah like a fire pot among pieces of wood, and a flaming torch among sheaves, so that they will consume on the right hand and on the left all the surrounding peoples, while the inhabitants of Jerusalem again dwell on their own sites in Jerusalem. To me, it indicates that the enemy is devoured on both the right and the left. That's what gets them more land. And it seems like inhabiting in their own place, they are still dwelling safely. Now, does that mean non-militarily? I'm not sure that that's what it means. I just think it means the issue of Israel itself existing is resolved. And I think that's where it gets. The fact that they have now gained, at least for a very brief period, peace and prosperity in the sense that they are finally recognized by their neighbors as saying, if you can't beat them, join them.
Okay.
That's not nearly as good as your comments, Jim.
We can start
Yeah.
looking at some of the questions that you've raised and Brother Jim has raised, but there's one question that we've discussed which I think is an important one as Bible students, and that is, what should we be using as our source of news on this? And I'll preface this by saying, I do not believe a thing I read on the internet.
What about Bible student internet?
You have one foot in the mouth. Would you like to try for two?
No.
Regarding Israel, you're saying?
Well, I think just in terms of how loose the information is and poorly managed and inflammatory. So what do we use for news sources, brethren?
Well, I personally use Arutz Sheva or Arutz 7, although I recognize that they are against the Kadima party primarily. I'm not sure who they're for. But it is news, just one has to read it a little carefully.
Len?
I think there's one thing that everyone needs to recognize. In our day, where we're in 24-hour-a-day news, 24 hour, I never had that before. Sometimes it would take you a week to find something out. There's one thing that's very important, and that is publicity is more important than truth. Cracking the story for a reporter is more important than getting the facts right. So don't believe the first story you read on something. I think that's why today I read the New York Times at work, but the business section only. I think that, they've had several violations. Financial Times is another one that does hatchet jobs on Israel. I think there's a bias that's in the press, and you can call it right, left, whatever. I'm not getting into that. I'm just saying that there's a bias because reporters are paid for cracking the story first. So what does that mean for us? I've tried to find over the years some useful sources that I think can give you some facts, and I know many of brethren from time to time do present these. Let me mention just a few. There's one that's started a few years ago called honestreporting.com. And it was started by a group who was very concerned after the profile of the wars in 67 and 83 especially, of how much the press changed their viewpoint within a few years on what the headlines were and what the story became years later. So they monitor all the media, and they actually conduct email campaigns to make sure facts are presented straightly. Now, again, these are made up of people of Jewish descent, but again, they're trying to protect the facts that are presented out to the public. There's another one that is non-Jewish in nature. It's called the American Communication Journal. That's acjournal.org. I would tell you to read a paper that was recently published there called A Concise History of the Photography Blog Storm in the 2006 Lebanon War. And it will tell you all the places where that was misreported in the first events that were sent out widespread across the world.